All right. So, way back when John Fetterman was running for the Senate in Pennsylvania in the Democratic primary against the much more corporate candidate Connor Lamb, and then in the general election against the absolutely deranged Dr. Oz, I would have called myself, somewhat of a supporter of his, right? I advocated for him in some ways. I always knew that he wasn't perfect, but generally I thought, hey, this guy seems like he's got decent economic policies, labor policies, etc., etc. He seems like he's, closer to Bernie Sanders than probably any other senator that we had at the time. Now, in the period that he has been in office, I think a lot of my views on him have definitely changed, especially since October 7th and Israel's recent genocidal campaign inside of Gaza, and he sort of exposed himself. Now, I always sort of thought that he wasn't great on Israel. In fact, I always thought he was bad on Israel. We've talked about the stories that have come out of him basically being terrified of AIPAC money and other pro-Israel groups funding his opponents, so he essentially allowed those lobbying groups to literally write his Israel policy. So I kind of knew he was always terrible when it came to that specific issue, but relatively better on other issues. Now, we have this more recent story that just came out here from NBC News from a recent interview that he conducted, where he just straight up says, "I'm not a progressive." Okay, and here's their headline: "I'm not a progressive. Fetterman breaks with the left." Showing a maverick side. Okay, so this part of the headline is, I think, hilarious, because what does the word maverick mean? Like, to me, and I haven't Googled the definition here, but like, a maverick is, I think, supposed to be somebody who sort of like breaks away from the norm, somebody who goes and they do their own thing, and they're not following the status quo, they're breaking away from the establishment, right? That's what I would think a maverick is, but we're talking about this in the context of him taking a pro-Israel stance and a more hard line on immigration. Those are two issues where you are just following in complete lockstep with what the establishment wants. That's not being a maverick, that's just being part of the elites, that's being part of the establishment. But anyways, that's an issue that I have with the headline here. But anyway, let's go ahead and read some of the details here, because again, "I'm not a progressive," pretty bold statement for somebody who was previously like even comparing himself to Bernie Sanders, and I'll get to that here in a second. But they say John Fetterman, Democrat from Pennsylvania, is breaking from progressives on hot button issues with his fiery support for Israel, and calls for Democrats to engage on tougher immigration laws, disappointing some on the left as he shows an independent streak. Again, whatever that means, as if, the entirety of the Democratic Party, or even a majority, or even a, small fraction of the Democratic Party is anti-Israel, or is pro-Palestinian. That's just not the case. I could count on my hands, or maybe two hands, the amount of Democrats elected in Congress, okay, who are actually trying to stand up for the Palestinian people, or who are standing up against Israel for some of their war crimes, the apartheid, the occupation, etc. So I wouldn't call that necessarily an independent streak. You're kind of just following in lockstep with what most members of Congress are actually supporting here, right? So they say he's also continually scolding Democrats for not pushing Senator Bob Menendez out of office after he was indicted on federal charges of taking bribes and acting as a foreign agent for Egypt, which the New Jersey Democrat denies. So this part of it is absolutely base. I mean, obviously, gold bar, Bob Menendez needs to go. I mean, for obvious reasons, right? Literally accepting bribes, acting as an agent of a foreign government in Egypt. I mean, come on. It's ridiculous that this is even a conversation. But they continue. They say, in an interview, the first-term Pennsylvania Democrat said that his critics shouldn't be surprised, saying, quote, "I'm not a progressive. I just think I'm a Democrat that is very committed to choice," meaning abortion rights, "and other things," right? I'm assuming that's what he means by choice, which is, that's a pretty standard Democrat position here. I wouldn't say that makes you a progressive, but with Israel, I'm going to be on the right side of that. Now, presumably he meant he's going to be on like the morally correct side of that equation, but really the actual reality here is that he is on the right-wing side of this issue. And immigration is something that is near and dear to me, and I think we have to do, I think we do have to effectively address it as well. So it's very non-specific. Obviously, he's going to give a little bit more details here in a second. Now, the context here is that there's been a debate within Congress where Republicans basically want tougher immigration laws to be put in place in exchange for the passage of more aid and weapons to Israel and more aid and weapons to Ukraine. Okay, so that's sort of the context of what he's referencing here, and it seems like he's willing to sell out the issue of immigration in order to get the aid to Ukraine and to Israel. They say Fetterman insisted that he can be pro-immigration while also favoring policies to restrict the flow of migration to manageable levels. Now, again, what does that actually mean, manageable levels? Disagreeing with progressives who oppose new limits on asylum and bash some of the ideas in the negotiations as cruel. He said, quote, it is a reasonable conversation until somebody can say that there's an explanation on what we can do when 270,000 people are being encountered on the border, not including the ones, of course, that we don't know about. To put that in reference, that is essentially the size of Pittsburgh, the second largest city in Pennsylvania. Okay, and again, he gives that context here saying that it's not ideal to have this conversation about asylum and parole policy in connection with an aid package for Israel and Ukraine. It's still one that we should have, given that Republicans have made it an essential condition to advance the supplemental bill. Progressives better do that because we can't leave Israel, we can't sell them out, and we can't sell Ukraine out, and we have to deliver on this, Fetterman said. I just would very much like to get a deal to deliver this critical aid. Okay, so that's essentially the gist of it here, right? Now, many people have pointed out that it's kind of ironic that he's taking a much more hardline stance on immigration because his wife, Giselle, I believe her name is, she was an illegal immigrant in the United States. She came from Brazil. She was an illegal immigrant for a period. She had, ended up getting a certain status and then became a citizen here, right? So some people have pointed out the irony here. Some people have said he is throwing his wife under the bus here. Now, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, when it comes to Israel aid, okay, this is a country that is currently using our weapons, our aid, to conduct what I think is a genocidal campaign inside of Gaza. They've killed at this point an estimated over 10,000 children, not just civilians, children. We have seen, like, the New York Times investigation, for example, showing that a majority, an outright majority, it's basically 2/3 of those who have been killed so far have been women and children, which doesn't even include the innocent men. Okay, in that equation. If you add that to it, it's upwards of 80-90% of the killed as a part of this offensive into Gaza have been civilians, all right? We're talking about them basically making the entirety of North Gaza completely unlivable, okay? Striking churches, mosques, schools, UN shelters, refugee camps, everything you can possibly imagine. Nothing has been safe inside of Gaza, specifically targeting journalists and poets and intellectuals, schools, everything that you could possibly imagine Israel is doing right now. Mass arresting people and going around and essentially conducting pogroms in the West Bank as well, which is not even under the control of Hamas. Okay, continuing to expand the illegal settlements, continuing to operate an apartheid. This is the country that we are giving billions of dollars in aid to, and now John Fetterman wants to give them even more, okay, to continue this campaign. He sees absolutely no issue whatsoever with what Israel has done in Gaza. He's gone out of his way to make that clear. Now, whether or not that's his actual position that he believes in his heart, I don't really give a shit. Whether it's, him, being terrified of AIPAC money or other pro-Israel lobbying groups spending against him, maybe that's a bigger factor. Who knows what it is at the end of the day? But the reality is that he is supporting this and effectively has blood on his hands as a, consequence of that. And so I think that, this shouldn't be surprising necessarily in terms of his Israel stance, because this is sort of what he ran on. I always knew that this was going to be his weak point. In terms of the Ukraine aid, at this point, I mean, I haven't really talked about Ukraine that much on this channel recently, especially with everything that's going on in Israel and Gaza. The Ukraine issue to me has gotten to the point where it's totally ridiculous. We've had, basically a year, the entire year of 2023, that has effectively been a stalemate. Okay, we have had botched attempts at negotiations in the past, which I think many people can make good arguments for, were sabotaged by the United States, by the rest of the West, that could have potentially ended this war sooner and actually brought about maybe better conditions for Ukraine, although they're not going to be good at the end of the day whenever you have negotiations. Better conditions for that kind of a negotiated settlement than what they're going to end up with now. And I don't think that you give them tens of billions of dollars more in additional weapons and additional aid, that's going to allow them to retake all of the territory that they have lost. And so it really just becomes a question of, like, how many more people are going to have to die before some sort of a negotiation is reached. That's how all wars end at the end of the day. They are always going to end with some sort of a peace agreement being reached. And I think that we've reached that point a long time ago, honestly, in Ukraine, where It's just not logistically possible for the ideal situation to happen, where Putin tucks his tail between his legs and he walks out of every inch of Ukrainian territory and they regain sovereignty and all of that good stuff. I just don't think that's necessarily on the table. And as we speak, I mean, we're continuing to have thousands and thousands of people die. I read a recent story that came out, it was about a month ago, on Ukraine that effectively said that hundreds of thousands of troops on either side, Russian and Ukrainian, have died as a part of this. We're talking about upwards of 500,000 who have been casualties of this war. Okay, whether that's killed in action, whether that's wounded for the rest of their lives, 500,000 people. Okay, not to mention the millions that had to flee Ukraine, not to mention the fact that they are now expanding the draft to include elderly people, to include, in many cases, disabled people as well. There's no aspect of this war, I think, that is beneficial to anybody at this point. And so, sort of, that's my outlook on Ukraine right now. And so I think, standing up for more additional aid packages instead of trying to actually get some sort of an agreement for lasting peace there is also not the best policy, right? So, I mean, again, this is John Fetterman for you. I don't think that I've ever seen this much of a 180 from a politician, at least in my lifetime, like where I've been keeping track of this, where I've been somewhat of a fan of somebody, and then they just completely turned around and sort of like stabbed the left in the back or walked away from it, or I don't know what you would want to call it. Now, granted, maybe he still has a lot of those other, leftist economic policy issues that he would be in favor of. Would he vote for Medicare for all? Probably, maybe, I would assume. Would he vote for like the PRO Act? Probably, maybe, I would assume. I don't know. But when it comes to these specific issues, he is certainly not a progressive, as he just said there, right? But as pointed out here by Isaiah, he says, funny, he was a progressive when he was asking me for my fucking money. I mean, listen, these are some of the things that he was saying. Ready to keep fighting for a stronger Pennsylvania. Chip in whatever you can to help us take this progressive momentum all the way to the ballot box, right? Another one here. Great hair or the greatest hair. Retweet if you're standing with these progressive champions. He's literally comparing himself to Bernie Sanders here. Now, granted, Bernie also hasn't been great on Israel either. But I mean, Throwback Thursday 2009, progressive rhetoric is great, but progressive results are 100. We have started a progressive movement here in Pennsylvania. I mean, this was also pointed out here by Vinny. You can go and scroll through. You do a Twitter search here. John Fetterman, progressive. Look at all of the statements that he's made, calling himself a progressive. And then he turns around and he says, I'm not a progressive. I'm a regular Democrat. I mean, come on. Look at how many, an endless series of tweets. Right? Then we also have this here from Austin Ox, just outright saying it. Let's listen to this real quick.
I'm John Fetterman, and I'm a Democrat, and I'm a progressive.
Okay, so listen, you went around, you fundraised on this, you repeatedly said that you were a progressive, you compared yourself to Bernie Sanders, the most progressive senator that we have in the United States. You said this. You fundraised off this. You took millions and millions of dollars from supporters running on this kind of campaign. And then to turn around and do a 180 like this and to say, I'm not a progressive, I'm just a regular Democrat, and then to accuse people who may have thought you were a progressive of being delusional, or as if we all just pulled this out of our ass and you didn't say that outright hundreds of times on the campaign trail to win your election, to win the Democratic primary against Connor Lamb. I mean, that was the whole reason you won the Democratic primary, right? Is because you were running on a more populist, a more left-wing, a more progressive campaign strategy. That's the whole comparison with you and Connor Lamb. Connor Lamb is the more corporate Democrat, right? You're the antithesis of that, or you're supposed to be the antithesis of that. That's how you ran your entire campaign, saying it openly, clearly, no mistakes about it, for everybody to hear. So to just turn around like that and pretend as if we all like hallucinated that, I mean, it's gaslighting to the most extreme point. Now again, I'm not trying to bash on Fetterman just for the sake of it. I'm sure, there are other policies where I would say that he's a progressive on. Maybe he'll bring up some legislation in the future that is very pro-worker, whatever the case may be. But when it comes to some of these issues, and when it comes to how he has acted during the Israel offensive into Gaza, when it comes to his more recent rhetoric on immigration, which, his immigration rhetoric, it wasn't great, but it also wasn't as extreme as it probably could have been. I think the context makes it a lot worse when you're talking about doing some sort of a massive deal to get aid to Ukraine and Israel as a swap for Republican immigration policies, that makes it much worse. But in terms of actually trying to form like a stable immigration system, that's something I would agree with. If by that you mean, okay, we need more immigration, judges to be able to process the amount of people who are coming in. We need a more effective legal framework for people to come in legally to the United States. We need to, address some of the history of the United States meddling in all of these different countries that have set them back, that have economically fucked them for decades and decades and decades in Central and South America. If that's the sort of thing that you're talking about, and you're not talking about just doing like a blanket restriction on immigrants coming to the United States as a sort of like malevolent deal or a cynical deal with Republicans because you want to give Israel a couple more $1 billion, then, I could see that first side of it. But if it's the latter half of that, then obviously, this is John Fetterman doing a very significant right-wing shift here. I don't know what the reason is behind this. Maybe you guys can tell me what your thoughts are on this. I don't know what the real reason is behind this. With Israel, it seems pretty transparently like it's just corruption, straight up and down corruption. You're scared of the lobbying money. You want to get the support of some of these groups, and so you sell out to them. You let them write your policy for Israel, etc., etc. So that seems pretty clear cut. But I don't know. I'll leave it up to you guys. Tell me what you think about this sort of like John Fetterman right-wing shift, I guess we'll call it.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying